altercator back. We had to restrain the professor. He was the one that lost his temper at work. There was a black-owned independent media company there to pick up our good brother when he was misunderstood by other outlets.
I think that who I am is like an eternal battle with me.
Is it truly the end of Marc versus Flip? No, it isn't. Thus, in this exchange between Flip and Marc, Marc was the one who was acting aggressively.
I take that as disrespectful. I'm not potting. I'm not potting. Nigga, don't say it. Are we talking about?
One has to wonder what the consequences of this massive blow-up will be now that the chips have fallen where they have fallen. It's the biggest blow-up I've ever experienced on the Joe Budden podcast, and perhaps the most intense because it resulted in one of the most famous breakups in podcast history when you looked me in the face and told me this show wasn't about me. However, this particular situation was the result of a lot of stress, worry, and the demands of being on the Joe Budden podcast, which is a pressure cooker. You even witnessed Joel, Flip, and Marc attempting to steer the conversation in spaces and, in Flip's case, to engage in job security.
Just taking a joke or what was said out of context, and that's what I did.
Or make an effort to maintain a spotless reputation. Regarding Marc,
responded to was this idea that I was talking about people's money behind the scenes. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. I don't really need to discuss the whole incident, but I'll leave that to y'all. I don't want to, but that's just ridiculous. And no one thinks I did that. It was clearly a joke. We joke about it all the time. We make jokes like that all the time about me being a lieutenant, about me being a supervisor, about playing into their narratives. There's no. You can thumbs down all you want, but the truth is, like, what are we talking about? First of all, why would I be discussing somebody else's pay? Why would I care how much somebody else makes? And why would somebody making less be to my advantage?
Flip's position is designated as a scheming individual who works behind the scenes to try to influence his other co-host Pei, whom he refers to as his brothers on air. And you observe that they all actually joined spaces and created Patreon content about the issues. Even the consequences from when they played Cleaning in the Air are happening now. They have fallen prey to the narratives that were prominently displayed throughout this altercation. Flip wants to appear as though he is doing the work to start.
People talk about it like, yo, Flip is really standoffish. He's not really welcoming. We're talking about something, and I told Joe that, and I said I have to get a little bit better at that.
On television, oh man, he says, you see, I simply have to be different and change because this is who I am. However, since Flip's channel features content from all of his treatment sessions, one has to question whether it's merely an act. Then, in a desperate attempt to show that he's not trying to make Flip appear to have given in, Marc is playing cleanup.
Follow me. No, not like that. I mean, like, let's work. Yeah, we went back to work. Not like you was bitching. I mean, like, you didn't want, you did the. No, I mean.
Here, right now. He is aware that Flip won't take it well and will turn around and exacerbate this dispute if he appears to be the same guy who was afraid of Marc. However, I don't believe any of them is taking into consideration this variable. The show's producer, Joe Budden, can now contribute to that. He might remark something like, hey, take a look at Flip one day. He was saying he let Marc finish his day, you know. Ever since Marc checked him, he has stopped interrupting him. And Flip will become upset with that. It will undoubtedly be content, but it will also lead to actual on-air conflicts between the two men. Additionally, Marc was supposed to be the one to elevate the Joe Budden show to an intellectual level when he originally arrived. How purely checks them on knowledge while also making fun of them.
Yeah. Yo.
I bathed in the dark. So so I can see that. We all like what we like. I don't blame that. I don't blame you. Playing with me.
You said nobody want to see that?
Murray Bertrand was a president. What is that? Said Murray Bertrand was a president. Of what? Them you hate shit. That was like chickens were really money. Are you gonna? No.
Making fun of the fact that they are unable to read everything that is happening, which is why these outbursts are happening. This is why I believe that the show isn't finished, because there are still many unresolved issues where even people from this so-called intellectual community would support Marc at the expense of other cast members.
There's something wrong with engaging the Flips of the world. I would never say, Andrew, Bakari, Angela, y'all should not engage the Flips. I'm saying I, Tiffany, have no desire to engage the flips of the world.
To be fair to the other cast members, however, intellectuals are unaware that Marc is equally as satisfied with everything as Flipper Joe. He loves to make people look foolish, even if he is well-versed in the world and other things. I am aware that he claims he dislikes punching down and making people seem foolish. I assume he thinks so, but it seems to me that he enjoys making people appear terrible. Additionally, it has made the show insecure. People have endured months on end of Marc's occasionally cruel sarcasm, with Joe on the sofa giving fuel, which has resulted in blow-ups. I'll say it again. It's entertaining. Remember that Marc is just a character on Joe's reality show, and that the Joe Budden podcast is an entertainment podcast. Meet the Press is not what this is. Although it is still entertainment, Joe got Marc to sort of respond to those thought-provoking questions. The fact that Marc was standing up for the intellectual community, ostensibly against Joe's attempts to hold them accountable, was one of the biggest rifts in the Marc versus Flip controversy.
Are you people? See, hold up, Marc. It ain't time for you to cop a plea for your friends.
On the Native Land podcast, Angela Rye would make the Joe Budden podcast seem to be the cause of America's decline in intellectualism. Now, is intellectualism in America in danger of dying because of the Joe Budden podcast? Since the podcast in its niche genuinely addresses serious topics where people talk about things like mental health, I seriously doubt it. Are they now sufficiently educated to engage in that discussion? Perhaps not. However, these individuals at least come from backgrounds where that discussion is necessary. Furthermore, it won't originate from sites like $1 Million Worth of Game, where the sole purpose of the interviews is to try to sell something to the viewers. It is an exaggerated infomercial. Then there's Drink Champs, where they actually drink alcohol, and one of the show's worst moments was when Irv Gotti, who was nearing the end of his life, appeared on the show and had to sip water while others drank. Therefore, Joe Budden is by far the greatest, the worst, and he continues to have the most entertaining podcast. Let's now examine The Breakfast Club, where Charlemagne has attempted to discuss mental health and political topics. Yes, that is also an ego stroke, and I don't believe anyone outside of Charlemagne's payees perceives him as intelligent. Even if you don't like Joe, he is just as smart as Charlemagne, which is likely why people like Angela Rye, who is signed to the iHeart Network, criticize him in the manner that they do. He has purchased his way into the intellectual cool table. I'm not attempting to support him, but I simply feel that I don't think much of Charlemagne's intelligence. I think he's really intelligent. He's really skilled at radio, in my opinion. He's really skilled with material, in my opinion. However, I don't like that people criticize Joe's methods for selecting content, but they hardly ever discuss how Charlemagne doesn't put in the effort when he speaks to politicians and is only attempting to use it as a springboard to get away from his previous shock jockeyism. But another aspect of Marc's tenure on the Joe Budden podcast that was brought to light by this Flip versus Marc tirade is that he still feels the need to justify his presence on the show all the time. I joined this podcast because, the industry abandoned me. He said in another Diet group. Even if that is the case, I think Marc does a fantastic job on the show. I simply want to include that in this video. Additionally, the world created by the Joe Budden show is far more fascinating than the academics who are supporting Marc. And it explains why, despite being a part of the iHeart Podcast Network, the Native Land podcast achieves the numbers it does. For example, since they aren't as fascinating, they don't have as much energy, they don't bring in casuals like Joe Budden does, and they tend to focus on topics that divide their audience. Perhaps you are still the foolish ones. The true story here is Flip versus Marc. They are now treading carefully, as I have stated throughout the film, but this is not the end of it. The Joe podcast is a pressure cooker where people are continuously interrupted and their feelings are not communicated, which results in significant backstage outbursts that spill over into the broadcast. Joe Budden also adores it. The members of the show are battling for verbal space and narrative control, behind all the family banter they attempt to project for the camera. Okay, everyone, but please share your thoughts in the comment section. Do you believe that the Marc vs. Flip is resolved, or do you believe that it will resurface? There are two possible outcomes for this, in my opinion. Joe will need to disturb the hierarchy by bringing in someone who isn't afraid of the pre-existing dynamics and will mix it up again, or they will either blow up again very soon, or they will walk on eggshells, making an interesting podcast less entertaining.
quite similar to what he's attempting to do with Mona and what Flip did when he first arrived. However, it appears that Mona is not interested in doing that. She wants to be there and get paid, but she understands that this gig is hectic.